I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honors of his word, the glory of his cross. Well, we're still in the book of Hebrews, and we'll probably finish it today. We'll move into James next week, but we'll see what happens. Hebrews 13 and verse 22 reads, "And I appeal to you, brethren, bear with the word of exhortation, for I have written to you in few words." There's a word in that verse that kind of sums up what type of letter the book of Hebrews is. Can you think of what I'm after? It's a book of
exhortation.
Right, Jeff. Right. What does that word mean? We hear that a lot. How would you describe what you?
Teaching or admonishing.
Yeah, it's an utterance, a discourse, like Gord said. What did you say, Gord?
Edifying.
Okay, yeah. Or a written address. So three can be given in that. But what does it convey? What is it telling you? Like, is an exhortation a teaching of doctrine?
Well, an exhortation could be any topic, but in our case, it's, teaching about Christ.
Okay then. What I was after was advice or recommendations. That's what exhortation is. It's conveying an urgent advice or conveying urgent recommendations. And when we think about that, there's 305 verses in the book of Hebrews, depending what version you're using. But 172 of them are verses of exhortation. Okay? And more than half of them are special appeals to the readers. That's why I've tried to keep us reminding us, the writer of this book, who he was aiming all his thoughts at. For instance, Hebrews 2 and verse 1. Hebrews 2 and verse 1. I was going to start at the back this morning, but maybe I will. Annette, not Jeremy. Annette, you do Hebrews 2 and verse 1.
Therefore, we ought to give the more earnest heed for the things which we have heard, lest at any time we should let them sleep.
Okay. What urgent advice is given there? What urgent advice is the Hebrew writer?
But you have to pay attention and to take heed unless you fall away or drift away.
Right.
From the truth.
Right, Carla. Yeah, drifting away. That was an urgent need for the people that he was writing to. And look at Hebrews 3 and verse 12. Hebrews 3 and verse 12. I'll give that to you, and you may.
Be careful then, dear brothers and sisters. Make sure that your own hearts are not evil and unbelieving, turning you away from the living God.
Okay. And what urgent recommendation is given there in this verse? What's our writer? Jeff?
It's a warning of self-examination.
Okay. Yeah. And why? Why then?
Well, if you're not right with God, it's a matter of unbelief. You have departed from God.
Okay, right. Departing from God. That's what I was after. And what about Hebrews 5? Hebrews 5 and verse 11. I'll give that one to
to Tammy. Oh, yeah, Hebrews 5, verse 11.
Of whom we have much to say, and hard to explain, since you have become dull of hearing.
Okay, and what advice is he giving there? Remember, exhortation. It's urgent.
You don't want to be dull of hearing.
Right. Be aware of that, in other words. And our last verse, Hebrews 10 and verse 22. And I'll let Jeff, Jeff, you can read that one.
10:22. Let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water.
Okay, and what urgent recommendation is he giving there, the writer? What advice?
Staying pure.
The which court?
Staying pure or keeping a pure heart.
Okay, and how do we do that?
By avoiding evil.
Okay, yeah.
Drawing near to God.
Right, that's what I was after. Draw near to God. I was going to call it my 4D words, but everybody uses a different version, so we couldn't do it that way. But we see then he knew what the Hebrew writer knew, what his readers needed to hear. And he knew that they were in need of endurance. Okay, because we got to keep reminding ourselves of what they were going through at this time. They're going through physical persecution. And we haven't endured that yet. So when we read these letters, sometimes we don't see the full impact that the writer's trying to get across. These members are suffering physical persecution. And so his desire is to remind them, this is urgent. You need to do these things because you're turning back to Judaism. And you can't do that. You need to stay with Christ. So, having said that, we move into the section of warnings and exhortations. And our question that Dave has asked is, what is the significance of the writer's exhortation for the Hebrews to go forth to Jesus outside the camp? If you turn to chapter 13 then, Hebrews 13, and we'll back up and start at verse 8, and we'll read from verse 8 to verse 13. So take 2 verses each, and maybe I'll start with Sandra and then move up to the front.
Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Do not be carried about with various and strange doctrines, for it is good that the heart be established by grace, not with foods which have not profited those who have been occupied with them.
And Gord?
We have an altar from which those who serve the tabernacle have no right to eat. But for the bodies of those animals whose blood is brought into the holy place by the high priest, and offering for sin are burnt outside the camp.
Therefore Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people with his own blood, suffered outside the gate. Therefore let us go forth to him outside the camp, bearing his reproach.
For here we do not have an enduring city, but we are looking for the city that it is to come. Through Jesus, therefore, let us continually offer to God a sacrifice of praise, the fruit of lips that openly profess his name.
Okay. In these passages, verse 8. Christ, it says, is the same yesterday, today, and forever. What should that do for our faith? Go ahead.
It should strengthen us. There's nothing worse than aiming for a prize and they change the rules midway through. Right? You're running a race. First place is supposed to get the prize, but they give it to the last place person.
Right.
Right? There's nothing worse than that. Well, we have confidence that Christ is not changing, that our reward is our reward.
Right.
Should we, follow what he asks us to do?
Yeah, exactly. And like you said, if Christ is not unchanging, then our faith should not be unchanging, right? It should be firm and solid in those things.
And the confidence we have is there's a difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament, the laws. And yet, those who are under the old law do not lose out because they were under the old law, even though the laws change.
Right.
Right? That's the confidence we have.
Right. And the Hebrew writer has shown us all along the greater benefits now, doesn't he? And that is what he is trying to have them see. And then in verse 9, we read there, he's asked them not to be carried about with various and strange doctrines. Like today, there's a plurality of religious doctrines around and existing. And our Hebrew writer has centered his arguments now against the disturbances that the Judaizer teachers are forcing upon these Christians. And remembering, we've just learned that Christ was singular in nature, so then the Hebrews were warned to be of a like mind, not to stray from the gospel. And then what does he say about being strengthened and established? How did he say to do that, to conquer that?
We need to stay away of different doctrines, I can say.
The which?
We need to stay away of different doctrines.
Okay, yeah.
And I think so it's okay to have a general knowledge of it, but to kind of try to dig in something that we know that is not the truth, it just can be confusing.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But he says there in the second sentence, for it is good that what should we use to establish our hearts? For it is good that the heart be established by what?
By grace.
Right.
Not foods.
Right.
And don't fall for every wind of doctrine that passes by, but strengthen yourself and by grace.
Okay, right. I was trying to center on that thought of grace, because what does John 1:17 tell us? Where did grace and truth come from? Who?
Right.
Right, from Christ. And when we think of grace, when you think of grace, how can that strengthen you?
None of us deserve God, but when we think that He is full of grace and mercy, then it encourages us to do better, to change.
Exactly.
To pay heed and focus on God and to be a better person.
Exactly. Yeah. Isn't that what we think of when we meet around the Lord's table? God's grace. When we stop and think about, and this is what he's trying to have the Hebrew brethren see, when we stop and think of what God has done for us, should that not strengthen us? Gord?
It kind of reminds me of when you do good to other people, that you're heaping coals of fire. All that grace that we have from God should really be coals of fires on our heads.
Right.
Wanting to draw near to Him, because that grace is, We couldn't earn that.
Exactly. It's something we need to always remind ourselves. But the Hebrew writer here is trying to have his listeners realize that instead of relying on the regulations of the old law, instead of relying on everything that was given to them under the old law regarding meats and all their regulations and ordinances, look to Christ. Because I think it's the next verse that we want to look at is verse 10. Verse 10 says, "We have an altar from which those who serve the tabernacle have no right to eat." The thought I wanted to grab from that verse was those that are going back to the old law, they have no right to receive any of the blessings that come from Christ. They've annulled that, haven't they? They've given them up. So they're no good to them. But we move on here just a bit. The next few verses are devoted to contrasts and likenesses. And that's similar to when we were looking at Christ and the priesthood. And remember now, some are still offering sacrifices under the old law. They're resorting back to that, and they're following the old covenant. And the sacrifices that some of the Hebrews were still being led to offer profited them nothing. Okay, that's the point. And the writer is trying to get them to see the futility of Moses' law and the effectiveness of Christ's law. Okay, that's what he's trying to have them see. And all through our study of Hebrews so far, we've seen how he's been masterful at this. He's given them two different situations and asking them to weigh out the benefits of Christ as opposed to following the Old Testament. And he's giving them things that they understand and know to reason with them. But he says in verse 10, he begins comparing two different sacrificial altars, okay, in this passage. The first was on the literal Mosaic altar, animals were offered, okay? And then he says, well, he doesn't say it, it was my questions. As Christians, okay, think of a sacrificial altar. As Christians, do we have an altar? Think about it. Literally, we don't, right?
We kind of have like a spiritual one,
right,
which is our faith.
Right, Gord. Right.
I mean, that's just my thought.
Right, but it's not literal
No.
or temporal. Neither, right? And remember, for this thought, I had to take myself back and put myself in the shoes of the Jewish people following the Old Covenant, because that altar was where the blood was sprinkled. That altar was all the sacrifices. And so they wanted to keep going back to that. But the writer is having us see that, no, we don't have a temporal or a literal altar, but our altar is the sacrificial service of Christ. That was how I could best word that. Bella?
Well, it's like a spiritual altar. When it's communion, when we have to partake of the Lord's Supper, it's a very special memorial where we have to respect and honor what is happening.
Right.
And focus on what Christ has done. We ought to do 3 things to remember him examine ourselves and proclaim his death. This is what he asked for. Like, remember him.
Right.
Do this in memory of me.
Right.
And we examine ourselves to make sure that, and you have to really focus to examine yourself, that what Christ has done for us, and not just take it blindly and all of that. And when we do so, we are proclaiming his death.
Exactly.
So it's a very important time. Not for like, we have to focus and know the purpose of that.
Exactly.
Not just when you eat the bread and you do whatever you want. We have to be appreciative of the sacrifice that Christ has done for us.
Right. We have to stay focused, don't we? But the writer, do you have your hand up, Gord?
No.
The writer is reminding them then by turning back to that literal altar and back to the Jewish way, they're forfeiting all their rights to the benefits that come from Christ. And Kala's point was good. It made me think, sometimes we operate by sight more than maybe deeply thinking. So the Jewish people, yes, they're seeing the altar, the sacrifices presented on it. But yes, when we meet around the Lord's table, we see all that in our minds and in our hearts. I've always described, when I always read heart in the Bible, I think of the center of our emotions, center of our thinking. That's where it should run.
Yeah, I just want to I thought that for Christians, our altar would be, physically this part, where we put the bread, where we put the Bible. That's what I thought that would mean for us. That would be
right.
The altar.
Yeah.
Where we keep our holy things, the bread, the Bible, and the wine.
Yeah.
So because I come from Catholic Church.
Okay.
And with us is the altar where is the praise, where he has his holy thing, and also all the Jesus Christ, Mary, like all the saints. But because Christian, we don't have that, but we still have the front part where we still have the bread.
Right.
So is that the altar for us, or we do not have an altar?
Well, yes, I think that's how I'm explaining it. It's not a literal altar. That table is not.
The connection that you have, spiritually you have in your head, you think about God.
Right.
But also you see that's a symbol. So it's a connection between the physical thing that you see and what you have in your mind. Like when I was Catholic, I always see a Jesus Christ there. I don't see him there,
see. Yeah.
but I keep him in my mind, and together with the bread or the wine, then that is when, for me, the altar.
Right. Okay, no, I understand what you mean. It's what you're viewing, when we view the bread and the fruit of the vine, that takes our minds to where? To Christ. Okay, so that if you want to, what you visualize when we're thinking of the sacrificial altar, what you visualize would be different with all of us. You know what I mean? Sometimes we imagine the cross on the hill, Christ on the cross, but what our thoughts are, where that takes our thoughts is to Christ and what He has done. Jeff, did you have?
Yeah, I'm thinking just it's in verse 10. I think we're focused, right? We
Yeah.
have an altar from which those who serve the tabernacle have no right to eat.
Right.
Right. When we think of that altar, maybe it goes beyond just focusing on the Lord's table.
Okay. Okay.
Because what we're showing here is that altar that being referred to, that they had
Right.
under the old covenant was that place, the bodies of the animals whose blood is, in verse 11, whose blood is brought into the sanctuary by the high priest for sin. That's the altar there. But it says, therefore Jesus, verse 12, therefore Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people with his own blood, suffered outside the gate. So the altar is Christ himself on the cross.
Right.
Sacrifice, all that embodies. And it's not just at the time of the Lord's table that pertains to us. Actually, even when we're baptized into Christ, we're baptized into his death. In a sense, we're coming to that altar even at that time.
Yes.
Any time in our life, every day or every hour of day or night, anytime we're focused on Christ, we're coming to that altar. It says in verse 15, we continually offer up the sacrifice of praise to God. So even when we praise God, it's at that altar. It is that Christ on the cross.
Okay.
Yeah, it's always, when the focus is on Christ, it's on death, burial, and resurrection.
Right. Right. No, that's good. We could have combined verses 10, 11, and 12 all together to understand that perfectly. I just kind of summed it up as the sacrificial service of Christ. But yeah, in verse 12, see, he's drawing parallels continually, isn't he, between the old covenant and the new covenant. And he's trying to have them see that what you're wanting to go back to is in no comparison to what you are being offered, what you're being benefited by through Christ. And the thought of the bodies of the sacrifices, the animals, even while their blood was taken into the holy place and offered, okay, for the sins of the people, then those animals were taken outside of the camp, outside of Jerusalem, and burned. Even in the tabernacle days, in the wilderness, they were burned. And he's trying to have us now to look at Christ. And Christ was taken outside of the city of Jerusalem, which, when you think about it, that would have been a security to the Jewish people, being inside the walls of the holy city. And Christ was taken out of there and put to shame, okay, by his death on the cross, and where his blood was shed for all mankind forever. And we could also remind ourselves that that blood was not literally taken to heaven, but figuratively, that was presented to the Father. Gord?
Can you imagine if we were still under the old covenant, the old law, how many sacrifices we'd have to do today with the number of people around? That is unimaginable.
Yeah.
Number of sheep, bulls, goats. And, people are screaming global warming and we got to cut back on all these gases or whatever. Imagine having all those extra animals around.
Yeah.
It would be impossible.
Right.
You would literally need more than a year to sacrifice that many animals.
That's right.
You just couldn't. It'd be almost impossible.
Physically, it's impossible.
Thankful we have something better.
Well, and that's, too, that brings you to the thought of forgiveness of our sins, wiped clean forever. It's gone. Our conscience, through our faith, can remind ourselves that ugly past, God doesn't even remember it. It's gone. He says it's gone. But under the old covenant, those sins weren't removed forever.
Only at the cross.
Right. Right.
Blood flowed both ways.
Yeah. So then we ended there with verse 13. The writer is now encouraging his readers to now go with, he says, verse 13 again, therefore let us go forth to him. And the him is Christ, outside the camp. Okay, and then bearing his reproach. That's what I thought about quite a bit. He's encouraging the Hebrew brethren, and in fact us, to go with Christ. Christ was taken out to that shameful cross, charged as a criminal, and we're asked to go with Christ, or to stand by is how I looked at it, to stand by with him in his humiliation, okay, and take joy with that reproach. And as I thought about that, think of maybe your best friend, and he's in some dire strait, and you don't go with him, you don't help him. Oh, well, you're on your own. I can't help you. But I thought about that as with Christians, that humiliation, and don't think of that as we're humiliated to be Christians. It's the suffering that he is wanting us to see. We're to go with Christ, okay? Stand by him. And it takes us back to the thought of being strengthened through grace, everything that Christ has done for us. Why wouldn't we want to go with him, stand by him? And he presents the consideration in chapter 11, and I believe 11 and verse 26. Yes, esteeming the reproach of Christ great riches than the treasures in Egypt. Speaking of Moses, for he looked forward to the reward. It just kind of goes along with that thought. No other thoughts on that then. But yeah, it's I find, because we're doing an overview, if you're doing a textual study, we would keep going back to the Old Covenant, reminding ourselves constantly of what the writer is trying to have the Christians compare here, contrast, the two different covenants, and see that under Christ, under the new covenant, it's far greater than the old. So our last section is faith, and we're asked, how do the examples of the Old Testament heroes of faith illustrate what it means to live by faith? We won't read that, but there's a lot of that. Remember Jeremy's sermon last week spoke a lot about the faith of those Old Testament characters. But what I thought of was God's people, no matter whom, no matter when in history, will suffer persecution. Okay? And some of those we heard last week in Jeremy's sermon. We're going to suffer persecution from family, from friends. Physical persecution may come. And chapter 11 is our writer's call to faith. In other words, he's bringing up these Old Testament characters and reminding them of what these Old Testament characters went through, but then telling how they finished, and they never saw the reward yet. They just aimed at the reward. And I thought of Paul's letter to the Corinthians. Remember in chapter 15, why did he write an entire chapter on the resurrection? Okay? And why did he write the entire chapter of chapter 13 on love, because they needed to hear it. It's what they needed to hear. And I thought of the question, why did our Hebrew writer write this whole chapter on faith? Same reason, isn't it? Because those Christians needed to hear it. And I thought, instead of going over a lot of thoughts from last weekend, or from last Sunday in Jeremy's lesson, just that we remind ourselves that, Jeff and I were talking about this after service, faith is a foundation, isn't it? You know, you build a house, you got to lay your forms in the bottom, build your foundation, and go from there. And it's what we stand on, and we move around on it. Every day we move around different situations, and faith helps us to live in confidence of what? Think of that, of chapter 11, the beginning verse. What is we live in confidence of what? The very first sentence in chapter 11, verse 1. The things hoped for was what I was after. We live in confidence of the things hoped for, that we're hoping for, and not hoping, don't get me wrong, not hoping in the sense, are we going to get to heaven? Because no, God's faithful. He's told us what we need to do, and when we've done that, then we need to be confident. I've been forgiven of my sins. When I fall short, I go to God in humbleness and seek forgiveness. And then I remind myself, He has forgiven me. So continue on. And really, faith always looks forward, doesn't it? Faith is always looking forward. And it's a demonstration. That's what Jeff and I talked about. That's how I kind of explained it. It's to your friends, to your family that are not Christians, your faith is a demonstration of the things hoped for. That's all it is. It's not a mystical thing. It's our act, and we'll look at that in the book of James in our next study. But the Hebrew writer is trying to remind these Christians of this, because they're losing that faith. They're looking elsewhere. When our confidence is shaken, then we look elsewhere for something to confide in, to strengthen us again. And he's telling them, you're looking in the wrong direction. And he uses all those Old Testament figures like Abraham. Abraham looked forward to a city with foundations, what God had promised him. Moses looked to a reward. They all looked. They never physically seen it. They saw it in their minds. And really, people of faith are pilgrims. That's all we are. We're pilgrims, and we're seeking a homeland. That's what we should be reminding ourselves of. Because we long for a better country, don't we? What the Bible has, what God has presented to us of eternity, we're looking forward to that. And so that motivates us to keep striving now, overcoming. Don't be drawn in. With us, maybe we're not so much drawn back to the Mosaic system as drawn back to the world and the system, the rules and things that we lived under before we became Christians. And of course, in that whole chapter, we see that people of faith move forward courageously, okay, and into the unknown. And verse 27 in that chapter says, because we see him who is invisible, meaning Christ, isn't it? And the first century brethren needed the encouragement in the worst way at that time because they were being physically persecuted. But we're no different. Just because we're maybe avoiding physical persecution, we still endure a lot of mockery. People don't want to hear. Some good friends don't want to hear, and sometimes family. They don't want to hear what you believe in. And so if we're not encouraged, if we're not confident, then we're resorting back to something. And one writer tried to point out faith. Sometimes faith isn't something that we maybe push aside in different situations, kind of hide it a little bit because it's a challenge at that time. It's not something that we do handle that way, hide it and then bring it out maybe when we feel strengthened and we're ready. It's something that we have to continue. And some of the ways, I thought chapter 11 is a beautiful chapter for encouragement, but I thought chapter 10, if we read chapter 10, a lot of that applies to us at this time, in our day and age. We need to have the confidence to freely enter into God's presence through Christ. We have that, we're told in chapter 10. And the fact that our faith can rest in full assurance, okay? Because Christ's work was done on our behalf, and our sins have been forgiven. We can rest assured of that. And we need to take a firm grip on the basics of our faith, which rest on the integrity of Christ. So, like I say, chapter 10 is a good chapter for us to read because we're all challenged daily. And in certain areas of life, we have more strength of overcoming weaknesses. Other weaknesses, we fight hard to overcome them. And we do it by reading what God's Word says to us.
I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to